So I'll go ahead. Just going to we'll go ahead and get started. I'm just going to introduce myself. My name is John. Um, and since we're a community identified place, the identifications that kind of feel salient for me to say right now is I identify as genderqueer. My pronouns are they, them. And I have white and able bodied privilege, living on occupied Cheyenne, Arapaho, and Utah land. So I'll pass it to you if you want to share any identities that feel salient right now.
Yeah, so my name's Sorin. I identify as queer and trans. Um, use they, their, them pronouns. And some salient identities for me, in addition to those, are that I'm white, able bodied. I grew up between cultures, so I identify as third culture kid, um, professional class.
Great, thank you so much. So I feel like many people have some type of connection to trauma, or at least the word trauma.
Mhm.
But maybe you might be able to sort of like share your own definition of trauma through the scope of your practice.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, my my relationship to trauma and my understanding of trauma is that it's really, um, any stimulus to our system that we perceived as overwhelming, unsafe, a threat. So something that could have either happened to us or that we witnessed, but something that really shook us. Um, and just the other day, I was talking with colleagues, and one of my colleagues, Jack, described the process of trauma on our system as a memory that doesn't get stored away quite like a memory, with closure and a time stamp, but something that remains open and active, and in that way, can surprise us, showing up in parts, times of our life that don't feel convenient, and can be really difficult to reconcile with because they can also feel alive and present in the moment. Um, so yeah, I think a general definition of trauma could just be something that's deeply distressing that stays with us, that doesn't have closure until it's has opportunity to heal.
Hmm.
What do you think of that?
Yeah, yeah. It was while you were speaking, I was just thinking about how with everything that's going on, and how maybe our former ways of connecting or being in community with people has sort of been taken away, or at least like stepped back considerably,
Mm-hmm.
as we have to kind of stay at home or quarantine, or we're being told that we need to isolate, um, by whatever mandate is happening within the community. And I
Mm-hmm.
was thinking about the way that those trauma memories, those fragments of memories that you say haven't been closed, can reappear. When we're in our homes, or just with ourselves.
Yeah, I think that's the other thing that can happen, for sure for me. I mean, oftentimes when we're talking about trauma, we talk about triggers, something active, that can trigger those trauma experiences for us. But I also find for myself, one of my ways of coping with trauma is to uh, to to distract and numb out through busyness and activity. And so certainly there are times when I'm exhausted, when I don't have stimulus, I'm at home, I'm alone. That then I think also trauma can kind of begin to drift to the surface, or any unprocessed emotions that I've been pushing away, because that's my strategy. And with distraction and activity, and then all of a sudden I find myself um, sad, and I've had some sadness that's been unprocessed that's coming up, or anger, or any other significant emotion.
I'm wondering if you wouldn't mind giving us or sharing with us a distraction.
My gosh, well,
I'm
all the things.
all the things, yeah.
Work is a distraction. Um, just I'm a very physically active person, so either working, or then I guess, yeah, mentally and physically, and then when I've got a little break, then I'm tidying up, or taking care of an animal, or just constantly moving. And then I'll sit down, and maybe breathe the way that we did, and just take a moment to rest and realize, whoa, I'm having some feelings about either something that happened today or the other day, or something that happened a long time ago. My mother passed about 10 years ago, and I find that grief is always waiting for me when I quiet down. And it could be because I missed her for something about her that I missed that was triggered, so to speak. um, or it could just be that I'm feeling good and happy, um, and miss her just because.
Mhm.
So that's one you could call certainly trauma, that shows up in all those ways.
Yeah. I was thinking today, I mean, I hate to make this one big, conversation about the most dour things ever, but I was really thinking today, I'm like, what feels really present right now and has for several months is like death and
Mm,
grief and loss. Because I was even thinking today about a tiny thing, about losing a tiny thing, but it felt so much bigger
mm-hmm.
because of the environment. I felt like the loss was so much bigger than it actually was.
Absolutely.
Um, and so you mentioned about quieting down, and I'm wondering, I hear about trauma sensitive mindfulness and meditation. Um, and I think about how quieting down isn't as easily accessed for some people. For some people who've experienced trauma, those like quiet or those silent moments can kind of be like terrifying.
Absolutely.
So I'm
Yeah,
curious. Oh, I was just going to say, I'm curious how you might, approach introducing mindfulness and meditation, to folks who have experienced trauma.
when I'm thinking about working with trauma and how to approach quietness, stillness, meditation, um, I think of going slow. I think of being gentle. I think of, listening and paying attention to um, what we uh, can comfortably tolerate without pushing ourselves over a limit. So, I would never say meditation, you have to sit perfectly still, or you have to absolutely quiet your mind, no thoughts. But wiggle if you want to wiggle.
Mm-hmm.
Think about whatever it is that you want to think about. Um, but the practice is finding our way to more and more uh, closeness with ourselves, developing a more and more of a capacity to be quiet and to be still. to really, find a way to process all of what we're experiencing. There's just going back to the grief that I experienced. I can only tolerate so much. I mean, that's just the truth of the enormity of my grief. And so I find ways to tolerate small amounts of grief, and then I have strategies to shut it down. Um, but ultimately, my goal is to be able to stay with my grief and find some way that that actually like enhances my life and feels good. That it's not a problem, that it's something quite beautiful. It's a human emotion.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love the idea of the acceptance around it being a human emotion, like you said.
Mm-hmm.
Um, yeah, that sounds really lovely. I'm curious how you actually feel about this. It's something I'm thinking about. You know, I hear, studying to be a therapist, I hear this used quite often. There's like the big T trauma, and then
Yeah.
there's like the little T trauma.
Yeah.
And I'm always kind of curious about like, what's the big T trauma, what's the little T trauma, and who gets to say what's the big T trauma and what's the little T trauma.
Mm-hmm.
Because I was thinking about today, since Queer Asterisk is really centering a specific set of identities within the experience of the programs of the organization itself, how perhaps those traumas, as a queer person, perhaps I tend to minimize some of those traumas because I come to expect them to happen. You know what I mean? Like it's your or from folks within marginalized locations, it's like the traumas, the microaggressions are being constantly felt on a regular basis, and how often like they can get internally minimized so that you might not even like be able to say, oh, I've experienced trauma. I'm just curious if I'm like way off base here in that thinking, or yeah.
No, I mean, I think, I would probably steer away from trauma with a capital T and a lowercase t, and just talk about, harm and internalized oppression and the ways that we, become accustomed to being harmed, to harming ourselves after, the oppressor is no longer present. We still continue to we can perpetuate that, and how to interrupt those things, collective trauma. So I think, what's more interesting to me in this moment is, but prompted by what you just said, is less about how we categorize these things, and more about, what other ways trauma and harm can manifest. And so, yeah, I mentioned a couple, and we can talk about those more in depth, but it's the things that happened to us, the things that we witnessed, the things that we pick up on in the field. As a trans person, I've experienced very few macroaggressions, being physically assaulted or I don't know, actively discriminated against in a malicious way. I also have a lot of privilege as a white person and a professional class person, but I feel connected to the collective trauma of my trans siblings and ancestors, and that doesn't escape me. And also, I experience it in a different way, but I still experience it. Um, and and there's the systemic ways that it it impacts me in just these microaggressive, insidious ways. And then, there's the complexity of what do we do with that too. Like you said, I could kind of grow accustomed to it and just begin to feel like this is how it is to be in the world. I'm invisible, or I'm hyper visible in a way that people, yeah, like pick at me, whatever that might mean. Um, so yeah, just interesting to talk about, the collective trauma and how we are both a part of it and also, may or may not be experiencing um, the macro aggressions.
Would you be up to respond if anyone who's watching has a question? Or
Sure.
I'm looking right now at, if I pronounce this incorrectly, I apologize. The case is right. Just kind of put tips on processing in a question. I'm going to assume, unless you chime in, that you mean tips on processing trauma.
Mm. You want me to just
Yeah, if you want to go ahead and, yeah, unless you want to correct us if that's not what you meant.
Yeah, I mean, some of the general tips on processing trauma that I can say briefly are to move slowly and gently. That's good. That's a yes, thanks. Um, yeah, and find safety and grow that safety. So it could be finding some level of comfort and safety in yourself. So that could be this stillness we're talking about, where you feel connected to yourself. And then I love this word titrating. So allowing small amounts of what you're hoping to process in, slowly and gently, and then yeah, and slowly working your way up to allowing more and more of those difficult emotions, um, sensations, whatever thoughts they might be, to come in. Sometimes we can create that safety for ourselves with others. That might be an option, which is a really beautiful one, is to build trust with somebody, and then same process through titration, slowly sharing more of what's distressing, for let um, that person help us contain it, until a lot of it can get out. Really for healing trauma, one of the things that I like to do, we talked about in the beginning that one way of describing trauma is as a kind of like an open memory, distressing that doesn't have closure, and isn't able to be processed with a timestamp that's done. It's over, but it still can feel alive in us. Um, and so the things that I like to do, or support my clients to do, is to find resolution to that memory, and either allow it to happen in kind of a guided meditation sort of way, or to create it and visualize it. I do a lot of visualizing, and then that can have some incredible uh, results I've found. And then another thing I'm thinking about too is just some of these practices that counselors are using, like EMDR training, which is really getting at that memory from a mechanical, um, neurochemical way, and helping it to find resolution.
Could you, if folks have never heard of EMDR before, could you
Yeah,
break it down?
yeah. Like the rapid eye movement therapy that replicates what we think it replicates REM sleep, so where your eyes are moving back and forth and reprocessing information. And so the idea is that as you are putting your attention on some of those distressing thoughts, sensations, emotions, memories, and you're moving your eyes back and forth in a way that stimulates your brain, bilateral stimulation, that the that your brain heals, and the intensity of those discursive thoughts, the traumatic images and feelings start to fade, actually.
Mhm.
Not textbook description. Yeah.
It was very helpful. You brought up collective trauma, and also it was mentioned in the chat space and as ancestral trauma.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was wondering how you've seen that show up, and also, how
Oh,
do you go about working with that? Because that's, it's sort of this ahistorical,
yeah.
stuff. Yeah.
And for example, that's also very heart. One uh, one statistic that is particularly heartbreaking, that the global average lifespan of a transgender person is estimated to be 23 years old. So the global average lifespan of a trans person is estimated to be 23 years old. Um, I have had more clients than I can count share with me that they don't imagine themselves living beyond the age of 23 without knowing this statistic. And we, have, yeah, they've shared this with me, that they just don't see a future. They don't know how their life will end. They don't necessarily think that they'll be someone to take their life, but just that they can't imagine their future. Um, and it finally clicked with me. And I remember one of my clients with whom I shared this statistic, and we both just sobbed, that they had somehow felt this in their system. And once we were able to talk about it, then it was able to shift. And I saw this client through their 23rd birthday, uh, started, working on what kind of career path they want for themselves and going back to school and all these things. Um, so yeah, I feel like that's one example of just how intuitively we can hold on to um, uh, information, or um, some experience that might not necessarily be ours, but feels intimately connected to us.
I'm wondering what you would say to folks within the LGBTQ community in this. Maybe those folks that aren't directly in the community but outside of the community that ask, well then how do I support or advocate for trans brothers and sisters? Like, what can I do?
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, one thing I think that we're doing is just being out and normalizing our experience ourselves. I've said this a lot, that while I do think I am a good therapist, I also think that, a lot of my value in the therapeutic setting, and the impact that I have, is just being an out queer and trans person, who lives a, you know, mm, reasonably happy and successful and normal life, and that's possible. So I think, one thing we can do is just be ourselves, and be visible, as who we are, and normalize all the different ways of being queer and trans. Um, but I also find, another thing that's really helpful is, this kind of like, well, have you considered? Um, so, when I hear somebody, really upset, they feel invisible, they feel, um, I don't know what's wrong with me, but I feel like, I'm not seen or heard. And then, for us to be able to recognize, systemic oppression, and say, well, have you considered that this might not be you? It might be, the way that our system treats queer and trans folks, and that's, it's natural that you might feel that. And I feel like that can lift a weight off of people, that, oh, it's not me. I'm not doing something wrong. I'm just experiencing the reality of a system. It doesn't necessarily change things and make things better, in that moment, but it certainly then can give us a little bit more, um, power or control over how we feel about ourselves, and kind of, take that off of us. It's not about me.
So I wanted to just quickly invite anyone who's here with us right now. If you'd like to ask a question, just go ahead and you can type it in the chat. Um, so maybe while we're waiting,
Yeah,
maybe you could you could tell everyone about how you came to arrive at Queer Asterisk,
sure.
how it was formed, um, where it is now, and then maybe projecting a little bit into what's coming up.
I came out as trans, when I was in graduate school at Naropa University. Before then, I was assigned female at birth and socialized a girl, and never really felt, like a girl or a woman, but also knew that I wasn't a boy or a man, and just had no idea that there was other genders out there. There were more options. And when I was in graduate school, I met someone who was out as non binary and trans, um, and just changed my life. I knew then that, there was a construct for my gender and a place for me. So I started socially transitioning and medically transitioning, and it was when I was moving through that medical system, that I felt, just so, I mean, that was something that, had been existing discrimination in the medical system for a long time, but I had never, experienced firsthand. And it just felt completely dehumanizing to have to defend, my identity to a medical professional in order to have access to medically necessary care. I mean, lots of other trans folks have this experience as well. And I thought at that time, I wonder what it would be like if, the, mental health professionals, because that was my field, or hopefully, the medical professionals, shared some of the experiences of their client identities, and would that shift the process, and the feeling of gatekeeping, and having to prove myself and defend myself. So that was the first, motivation and the vision for Queer Asterisk, was, to create a, mental health, a community mental health organization, by and for the LGBT community, to gentle that process. And, when we think about it from a clinical perspective, we would call that trauma informed care, to consider, the potential for trauma or the actual trauma, of the people who are reaching out to us for services, and to do our best to mitigate that and soften that experience. So when I can say to my client, you know, yeah, I've been through this myself, and I would be happy to write you a letter. You know, I'd love to just hear your story, not because you need to prove to me who you are, but because I'd love to hear, you know, more stories from other queer and trans folks and have that share that experience with you. And then, you know, here's your letter. Go, um, you know, go do your thing, your beautiful thing. That was the vision for Queer Asterisk.
I'm wondering if that doesn't tie in a little bit to this question that just showed up in the chat. How can we honor and bring justice, healing to our queer and trans ancestors? Thank you, listening succulent.
Yeah, the question was, how can we honor what?
How can we honor and bring justice slash healing to our queer and trans ancestors?
Yeah, yeah, I think about this a lot. I know that queer trans people came before me, perhaps in my bloodline, but certainly in, you know, the human family before me. And I don't know all of their specific struggles, but I do have a sense that um, being who they are um, was a struggle. And so I feel like how I honor that struggle is to be myself, and um, and create a path for more people to be themselves, and to normalize for all the people that being ourselves is we're better for it as a collective community than when we're all conforming. I feel like that's a huge fallacy that we're better if we're conforming. And so that's how I honor who came before me, is to live what they might not have been able to live fully.
Mm-hmm. Here's a question. Well, you know, everything's moved virtually. You
Yeah.
know, schools have moved virtually, therapy's moved into the virtual sphere. People in their offices have gone home, and now they're doing everything over Zoom. So Brooke Trout 27 um, asks tips on processing trauma via teletherapy and without the safe space of the therapy office.
Mm. Yeah, you know, this is definitely something that is a challenge of COVID times, is not being able to go to a place that hopefully you feel safe. And so I've been working with, and at Queer Asterisk, we've been working with our clients to create safety where they are. And you know, sometimes that is a physical room or space, or going outside. I go for walks with my clients. We both take our sessions on the phone and go to a park and talk while we're walking, so possible, getting out of the house. But also, you know, I think about some of the inspirational stories I've heard from folks who were imprisoned. You know, what can't be taken away from us. Um, and when I'm feeling most unsafe myself, if I can, I try to come back to what can't be taken away. My breath, you know, can't be taken away. What's happening in my mind can't be taken away. And so that's why we are often helping folks to develop both external resources and also internal resources, because those internal resources oftentimes can't be taken away from us. So I don't know if that helps, but um, I yeah, I would be looking for what are the small what is the smallest thing that feels safe and comfortable to me, that can't be taken away, that's with me everywhere, and growing from there.
And two, with Queer Asterisk, is that there's this plethora of opportunities to connect, from the home,
Mm-hmm.
through all of the community programs that have been started, and then also those community programs have now moved online.
Yeah. I think I saw there a question about folks who are experiencing homelessness. Do you want to read
Yeah.
that?
Do you want me to read it for you?
Yeah.
Okay. From Triclops Tadpole. What does bringing greater access to mental health for queer and trans folks experiencing homelessness
Mm-hmm.
look like? And then they added look like.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, I think that this is not the place that we started. There are organizations that have a mission of bringing mental health care to folks experiencing homelessness, but certainly a place that we are expanding into. Before COVID, we had been in conversation about moving towards a community-based services program, and the model for that is actually moving out into the community and meeting people where they're at. I worked at a mental health partners, get called to shelters, we'd get called to um, locations in town, and meet people in crisis there, and serve them, and then find them support. So I would say, unfortunately, there's anybody can access our services right now, if they have access to a phone or the internet. But also, when we're able to go back into in-person sessions, we do have a plan to develop this program where we can meet people wherever they're struggling.
Mm-hmm. We're going to take one more question.
Right?
This is a question from. I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing this. The Kais is right. I don't know if I'm mispronouncing KAIS, so I apologize if I am. But they've ended this question with what resources would you recommend around somatics and slash embodiment?
Sure. Yeah, I think the question, I'm going to interpret it as there are somatic counselors, and so there's ways that you can find a counselor who practices somatic psychotherapy. Um, one of the things that's been most helpful to me has been martial arts practices and sports and hiking, and just physically engaging my body. People love to garden and put their hands in the earth, go for hikes, and touch trees and pick flowers, and um, dance. And so I think there's lots of ways to engage the body. And then I would love to have a conversation with you further about more what specifically you're asking. Um, but I hope that scratched the surface.
So before we go, I just want to say, to find more information on the community programs that are occurring every week, I think maybe like 5, 6 days, maybe every day of the week. You can look at the Queer Asterisk Instagram. On the grid, there are different photos with the dates and what's happening during the week, or you can go to Facebook, look up Queer Asterisk, and then you can look at the event calendar. Or the website, is it queerasterisk.com? Queerasterisk.com.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Sorin. I had a great time.
Yeah. Thanks, John. It was really sweet.
And thank you, everyone, for watching.